Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is May 9th, 2016, and we're going to discuss a lot of different topics tonight, but we're going to get into the Syrian crisis a little more in depth for the most part of the show. The Syrian peace talks. So I've been gone for about 2 weeks from the show. The week before, we interviewed James Hinton, and we didn't get to cover as much information about Syria then, and then last week I was totally absent. But this week, I want to talk about something. We want to go back a little bit further to mid-April and look at the Syrian peace talks as they fell apart. And most of us who watched this stuff expected that they would fall apart from day one. Right? The Syrian ceasefire agreement, the Geneva peace talks, they've all been broken now, largely, and it's going to be a return to full-scale fighting, right? And this is pretty much what we've seen. We have an announcement that was made by the representation of the so-called Syrian opposition members that were taking part in the Geneva talks that made clear that the opposition was halting formal peace talks with the Syrian government, and that the moderate terrorists would resume combat operations against the Syrian military. So it was reported that terrorists had launched a fresh attack in northwestern Syria, the provinces of Latakia and Hama, and that terrorist forces were claiming that their decision to renew their attacks was actually a response to, quote, an increase in attacks on residential areas and displaced people by the Syrian military, obviously. Their announcement said, after the increase of violations by the regime forces that included targeting displaced people and continuous bombing of residential neighborhoods, we declare the start of the battle in response, end quote. Well, if you're listening to this show, you know damn well that the Syrian military is not attacking residential areas, and they're not attacking displaced people. They're attacking terrorist-controlled territory and terrorist organizations. So you remember, a number of terrorist groups were never considered to be part of the Syrian ceasefire to begin with. Nusra, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, for instance, none of those groups were included in the ceasefire plan, and they were considered legitimate targets for military operation. Groups considered part of the moderate opposition were given protection from the Syrian army assault. The entire classification system for these terrorist organizations was and how they were considered legitimate targets, which ones were not considered legitimate targets, was entirely a farce by the West that was concocted so that the Western machinations of arming terrorist brigades would be able to continue while the rifles of the SAA were silent. The West's support for the ceasefire itself was nothing more than an attempt to buy breathing room and time to regroup for the terrorist proxies. They've been sustaining massive losses on the ground by virtue of the Syrian assaults and the Russian assaults as well. And this was merely an attempt to get breathing room and recovery room for these terrorist forces. So the West knew full well that these moderate terrorists were absolutely no different from the extremist versions of ISIS and Nusra and Al-Qaeda. The West was also fully aware of the fact that virtually all of these groups supported and coordinated and fought with at least one of the groups excluded from the ceasefire, and then for that reason they functioned as allies of ISIS and not the organization's enemy. So all of these groups were tangled together in a web that the West knew very well which strings to pull on, because they orchestrated the web to begin with. Now, regardless of all this, the High Negotiations Committee, the HNC, that's the official Syrian Opposition Negotiating Committee that's working in Geneva, announced that it was suspending formal peace talks. And that was a statement that was shortly after that corroborated by Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy to Syria. The HNC said that it would remain in Geneva, of course, right, because who doesn't want to be in Geneva in a nice hotel, and that they would continue with informal discussions between its own terrorist constituency and the Syrian government, and that the two opposing bodies would be taking stock of the situation. So the collapse of the ceasefire agreement is concerning for more reasons than the fact that full-scale fighting is going to return to Syria after 5 years of it. But the U.S. and its imperialist coalition are now discussing not only continuing but increasing their support to terrorists on the ground, right? By providing them with more sophisticated weaponry, possibly even man-pads, and we're going to get into that. And if the introduction of man-pads, for instance, to the Syrian battlefield on a massive scale is going to pose a direct threat to the Russian Air Force as well as the passenger airliners across the world. It's also a threat that's not going to be taken lightly by the Russians. And with the failure of the ceasefire, we see that the NATO powers are simply moving into another phase of support for proxy forces fighting against the Syrian government. And unfortunately, the very real possibility now that this new phase involves the escalation of Western involvement and the potential for a clash between two nuclear powers, which is always there. Go read the article, Syrian Opposition Ends Peace Talks, Launches New Offensive in Northwestern Syria for some more details on that. But the issue of the man-pads, this is something that needs to be addressed. The CIA is reportedly discussing a plan to augment the fighting capability of terrorist proxies they've been supporting since 2011 and even much further before that. They've been stating if the ceasefire agreement were to fall apart, then they were looking at other options, right? There's a discussion that's centered around the supply of weaponry that would help the jihadists, quote, better respond to the Syrian and Russian air forces. A very dangerous proposition. The discussion, and I put discussion in quotes, is centered around the possibility of sending a variety of anti-aircraft technologies that go to from the extreme of man-pads to less portable systems, including the Soviet-era BM-21 Grad missiles. And we got reports by the Wall Street Journal that the CIA has given provisional assurances to coalition members to expand support to forces fighting against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad if the ceasefire falls apart and full-scale fighting resumes. The United States is declaring the right to determine which weapons will be introduced to the battlefield as part of this renewed effort to arm terrorists fighting the Syrian government. Of course, it's not renewed. It never stopped to begin with. The discussions that are going on between the United States and its so-called coalition members were part of a plan that the Washington Post described as Plan B for Syria if the ceasefire talks fell through and that the fighting resumed. We've got a report by RT. It says, on the eve of the ceasefire agreement coming into effect in Syria at midnight on February 27th, the heads of Middle East intelligence agencies met to lay out a plan for waging war after the truce, and consultations on the matter never stopped ever since, end quote. We've got, according to Adam Intus for the Wall Street Journal, in those meetings, officials briefed on the deliberations said that coalition members received provisional assurances from the CIA that they would be given approval to expand support to Syria's moderate opposition, read moderate terrorists. The coalition members have agreed on the outlines of Plan B, but the White House still needs to approve a list of specific Plan B weapon systems before they can be introduced to the battlefield. The officials that are quoted by Intus says that the CIA made clear to the allies that the new systems, once they were agreed upon, would be given to the terrorist only if the truce and the concurrent political track toward lasting peace, Plan A, fell apart and full-scale fighting resumed. They quote a senior U.S. official saying, referring to the CIA's message to the coalition, that the agreement is to up the ante if needed. That's what they want to say. That's an open admission of escalation. They say their main focus was on how to find ways to make the cessation of hostilities and political negotiations stick. Well, in other words, as we've discussed before, these ceasefire agreements are nothing but a regrouping effort aimed at the designed to help the proxy terrorist on the ground. The development of the weapons list is according to the Wall Street Journal, part of a broader behind-the-scenes effort by the Obama administration to deter its adversaries in the Syrian conflict while preventing the U.S. coalition partners who are supporting the moderate opposition from taking matters into their own hands. Well, they won't be doing that, will they? Because they function as puppets in proxy countries. So we've got a lot of experts now saying that the terrorists are most in need of technological assistance and electronic means to defeat and skirt around Assad's artillery and air force. Of course, these discussions, I should mention, are taking place between Washington, Ankara, and Riyadh, so Saudi Arabia and Turkey in the United States. Now, back to what these experts, these weapons experts, military experts, are claiming that the death squad fighters, what they need are various types of technology and electronic means to get around the artillery and air force, because that's what's actually providing most massive amounts of damage to the fighting capabilities of the terrorists there. For this purpose, though, manpads stand for man-portable air defense systems, by the way. They're essentially anti-aircraft missiles that are able to be carried around and used by individuals on the ground. They're being brought up for discussion as a legitimate option for weapons assistance to terrorists, despite the fact that the reports suggest that the U.S. is hesitant to provide them. We're not convinced that the U.S. is hesitant to provide them. Maybe they are somewhat hesitant, but I would caution that the U.S. is the only country here that, or the U.S. is the country that is holding all this back. I think we will see the introduction of manpads to the battlefield soon enough. But Turkey and Saudi Arabia are reportedly fairly eager to provide the portable system. So it's quite possible that while the U.S. is exhibiting some signs of hesitancy to send these manpads into the battlefield, that Turkey and Saudi Arabia are being held back by the United States. These two are not only in a war psychosis, but there's a lack of grasp of reality, both by the Saudi Arabians and the Turks, that would logically see them more ready to send those manpads to terrorists in Syria than even the United States, which is apparently also committed to destroying the entire world in a nuclear conflagration of some type. But when you make the United States seem like the more rational party, then you've gone truly off the deep end. Now, the provision of manpads, why is this so important? If Al-Qaeda and ISIS gets manpads, if these organizations are in possession of the means by which to down aircraft from the ground, we're going to have civilian passenger aircraft the world over finding itself in danger of being taken down out of the sky as a result of terror attacks aimed at sensitive targets. And civilian passengers are going to be put at risk with known terrorists and known terrorist organizations in possession of this powerful weaponry. It's capable of targeting them from the ground. And civilian airliners are indeed sensitive targets. They're open. They're sitting ducks if you're going to use this type of technology. If they are using and are provided manpads, and if a civilian airliner is in fact targeted, then it has got to be remembered that it's the United States and it's Turkey and Saudi Arabia that are directly responsible for the death of these innocent civilians that would inevitably follow if a terrorist organization fires a missile at a passenger airliner. It's the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia that should be held accountable for that because they provided those organizations with the weapons. Now, also, if terrorist rebels are in possession of a sizable armory of manpads, they've already got a few, but we're going to see a new and greater threat to the Syrian and Russian air forces. And according to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. officials have already addressed this issue with the Russian counterparts and have done so in a manner that resembles a threat much more than a genuine discussion. The Wall Street Journal tells us that the U.S. officials have conveyed a private message to the Russians indicating that, quote, a return to full-scale fighting could end up putting more Russian pilots in danger, end quote. That's a threat. we have a senior Obama administration official to Moscow, quoted by the Wall Street Journal, if the ceasefire collapses, if the negotiations don't go anywhere, and we're back to full throttle civil war, all bets will be off. The outside patrons will double and triple down, throwing everything they can into Syria, including much more lethal weaponry. End quote. That's also a threat. But the American position, obviously, seems to be a warning to the Russians that if the fighting resumes, and the fighting, meaning between the Syrian government and the phantom moderate rebels and the protected terrorists, then the U.S. will resume assistance to the terrorists, and I, again, put resume in quotes because they would double down on their assistance to the terrorists. And it's going to manifest itself in a way that threatens Russian pilots directly. That's a highly incendiary move, to say the least, since Russia is not likely to take a threat to its military personnel lightly. And it's not reasonable to believe that that the Russians will simply back down or stick to a business-as-usual method in regards to the shooting down of another Russian jet. Terrorists in Syria have already had access to a small number of man-pads that the CIA claims they purchased through illicit channels, but most of a lot of the researchers, I should say, have actually felt they've been provided the man-pads by the CIA itself, or at least by Saudi Arabia or Turkey. And the CIA, of course, refused to comment on this alleged Plan B when they were contacted by Sputnik in mid-April. Now, all of those threats that were made in the event that the ceasefire falls apart, and we talked about, as soon as we started the show, that the ceasefire did indeed fall apart. So now that's where we are. Now, recently Obama, another sign of the obvious Western escalation in the war against Syria. We talked about the ceasefire falling apart, the earlier threats that if the ceasefire falls apart, we would see an escalation. Well, now we see an escalation. Barack Obama announced in late April that an additional 250 American military personnel are going to be deployed to Syria under the guise of defeating ISIS. This is what Obama said from Hanover, Germany. He says, quote, "Just as I approved additional support for Iraqi forces against ISIL, I've decided to increase U.S. support for local forces fighting ISIL in Syria. A small number of special operations forces are already on the ground in Syria, and their expertise has been critical as local forces have driven ISIL out of key areas. So given their success, I've approved the deployment of up to 250 additional U.S. personnel in Syria, including special forces, to keep up this momentum." He also says that he made a point to state that the troops wouldn't be leading the fight on the ground, but that they would be engaged in training and providing assistance to local forces. Now, who are the local forces that he's talking about? It's not the Syrian military, of course. It's actually the terrorists themselves. Obama, of course, reiterated the U.S. position that Assad must go. He says, just as we remain relentless on the military front, we're not going to give up on diplomacy to end the civil war in Syria, because the suffering of the people in Syria has to end, and that requires an effective political transition. End quote. Yeah, it does require an effective political transition here in the United States, not in Syria. Of course, what a stunning statement of duplicity, right? That the U.S. is looking at a diplomatic end to the Civil War. It's not a civil war. It's an invasion that you are sponsoring, right? This is an essentially American invasion, with the Americans leading from behind of Syria. There are about 5 lies in one sentence. Maybe not a personal best even for Obama, but it's up there. Now, the CNN reports now that the troops are going to be expanding the effort led by the U.S. to bring in more Syrian Arab fighters into units the U.S. supports in northern Syria that have been manned by the Kurds. Okay, well, what does that mean? Syrian Arab fighters. Well, they don't mean Syrian Arab army. They mean terrorists. They mean death squad fighters. They mean more phantom moderate rebels. They mean jihadists. Bearded monkeys that they've been funding since the beginning of this war. And they want to put them in areas in northern Syria that have been manned by the Kurds. Well, why would they want to do that? The U.S. has been working with the Kurds on and off but they don't want the Kurds to seal the border. The Kurds would indeed seal the border for all of their faults, and there are many of the Kurdish organizations, the YPG, the PKK, and all of the bizarre communist, cultural Marxist idiocy, and their own factional obsessions that have led them to kick people out of their homes, to slaughter people based on their religion or ethnicity. The Kurds are no angels by any means, but they would seal the border because it's to their own self-interest to seal the border with Turkey, and that's what they're going to do. But if they do that, the supply lines to ISIS and to the terrorists in Syria are cut, and the U.S. can't have that. So they want terrorist fighters to go into the areas that have been manned by the Kurds to make sure that those supply lines remain open. Now, this plan by Obama is calling for additional U.S. forces to advise and assist forces in the area that the U.S. hopes are going to go strong enough to take back the territory around Raqqa. Now, Raqqa is going to fall, don't worry. As soon as Aleppo falls, Raqqa will fall, and Raqqa will fall much easier than Aleppo. But the advise and assist forces, the advise and assist has been used since Vietnam, and actually since Korea. And we all know what that means. That means that it's clandestine operations. They're there to advise and assist, but they engage in combat operations. But they're advising and assisting forces that are going to be operating around Raqqa. Well, who's operating around Raqqa? It's terrorist forces. Now, they say the troops are not expected to engage in combat operations or to participate in target-to-kill teams, but are going to be able to defend themselves. All right, that's clandestine operations. We know this. Now, what all of these statements mean is that the United States is deploying troops to better assist, train, and organize terrorists on the ground who are fighting Assad and the Syrian military. These fighters that the U.S. supports are nothing more than ISIS, Al-Qaeda, FSA, Nusra, and other groups and groupuscules that are ideologically identical to one another. And the only real tangible difference between the groups are the names that they give themselves. Not only that, any talk of the recent successes against ISIS, as Obama put it, that's clearly not the successes of the United States. It's not the success of NATO. It's not the success of the anti-Syria coalition. It's the success of Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, Russia. Those are the countries that are succeeding. Iraq. The forces that I just mentioned, the latter forces there, the Hezbollah forces, Syria, Iran, etc., they have achieved in weeks what the NATO, United States, anti-Syria coalition could not achieve in over a year. And according to the United States, it would take 10 years to do. That's a true testament to what can be achieved when a country actually targets the terrorist organization itself, and as opposed to supporting it. When you actually bomb ISIS instead of giving it bombs, there are vastly different results. So it's still important to point out, though, that regardless of Obama's recent announcement, U.S. Special Forces have been present in Syria for a long time, and NATO Special Forces members were known publicly even earlier than that. Now, so we've got this announcement in late April 2016, but in October of 2015, it was announced by the White House that 50 Special Forces troops would be sent to Syria. This announcement came days after it was reported that the U.S. Special Forces commandos were working with Kurdish forces to free prisoners of the Islamic State in Syria. And later than that, the presence of U.S. Special Forces in Syria was tacitly acknowledged in 2015 when the U.S. took credit for the killing of Abu Sayyaf. Now, go back even further, though. Reports were circulating in October 2014 that the U.S. soldiers and Special Forces troops were fighting alongside Kurdish battalions in Kobane. We had an article by Christoph Lehmann published in March 20th, 2015, where he says, evidence about the presence of U.S. Special Forces in the Syrian town Ain al-Arab, also known as Kobane, emerged. Troops are guiding U.S. airstrikes as part of U.S. support for the Kurdish separatist group PYD and the long-established plan to establish a Kurdish corridor. All right, so we've got that. We also had a photo taken in Ain al-Arab that showed 3 U.S. soldiers, one of them that they called Peter, carrying a Bushnell laser rangefinder, which is an instrument that it marks targets for U.S. jets. And those reports came from Seyun Bozkurt for the Aydınlık Daily. Now, we've got the photo also of 3 U.S. troopers that substantiates a claim by the PYD spokesman Polat Khan from October 14th, 2014. Again, according to Aydınlık Daily, the Khan admitted that a special unit in Kobani provides Kurdish fighters with the coordinates of targets, and then those targets, the coordinates, would be relayed to the coalition forces and then bombed subsequently. Now, the first public U.S. Special Forces raid in Syria took place in July 2014 when Delta Force personnel allegedly attempted to rescue several Americans that were being held by ISIS near Raqqa. Allegedly, the soldiers stormed the facility, but the terrorists had already moved the hostages. The raid itself, of course, for what we're discussing here, provides evidence that U.S. Special Forces were operating in Syria in 2014. Now, many researchers believe the story itself is simply fabricated by the White House to provide legitimacy to the stories of murdered hostages and the subsequent pro-war propaganda that came out of that. To promote the gradual acceptance of U.S. troops on the ground in Syria. There wasn't much of an outcry as a result. If you want to go back further, though, in 2012, we had an article published by the Daily Star by Deborah Sherwood that revealed that the SAS Special Forces and MI6 agents, that's British, were operating inside Syria shortly after the destabilization campaign began in earnest. You can look at that article. Sherwood, according to Sherwood, here's what she says. Special forces will help protect the refugees in Syria along the borders. Last week, as the president ignored an international ceasefire, she's referring to Assad, that's not true, plans were being finalized to rescue thousands of Syrians. SAS troops and MI6 agents are in the country, ready to help rebels if civil war breaks out as expected this weekend. They also have high-tech satellite computers and radios that can instantly send back photos and details of refugees and Assad's forces as the situation develops. Whitehall sources say it is vital they can see what is happening on the ground for themselves, so Assad cannot deny atrocities or battles. And if civil war breaks out, crack troops are on hand to help with the fighting, say the insider. Safe havens would be an invasion of Syria, but a chance to save lives, said a senior Whitehall source. The SAS will throw an armed screen around these areas that can be set up within hours. There are guys in the communications unit who are signalers that can go right up front and get involved in close quarter fighting, end quote. In March 2012, also the Daily Star reported that 13 French intelligence agents had been captured by the Syrian government. And that shows not only that Western special operations were present in Syria, but also that they existed essentially from the start. Again, this is 2012, right? So the presence of NATO special forces and U.S. special forces specifically are nothing new at all in Syria. And if these are the things that are known publicly, one can only imagine the clandestine operations that are taking place that are not known publicly. So Obama's announcement is simply the advertisement of a policy that's gradually escalating in regards to Syria, and as a result, again, threatens to provoke another confrontation between the U.S., I should not say us, the U.S. and Russia. Now, let's, I want to draw your attention to one video by Afra Dogger, who she has been on the show a couple of times. She does a lot of good work. There's, on my website, BrandonTurbeville.com, Syrian analyst Afra Dogger speaks on Aleppo Syrian ceasefire and exploitation in refugee camps. In this video, She did this video with John Kontouris of Greek News on Demand. It's a very good video. It's an important update regarding the situation in Syria and Aleppo. They address the ceasefire agreement, which she argues is nothing more than an attempt to buy time for terrorists to regroup and rearm. I agree. She talks about the false accusations of killing civilians that has been leveled against the Syrian government and the Syrian military by the Western media. The transitional government, which she points out, doesn't represent the Syrian people. It's not democratic, and it's not even Syrian. She also talks about sexual assault in refugee camps, and there's documented video evidence and reports of wealthy Saudi men preying upon women and young girls and children in Syrian refugee camps for sex and marriage. So go look up that video, and you can see some of that information on the video. Now, we've got a report by John Rosenthal. Actually, let's skip the Rosenthal report right now, because we're coming up in the second half of the show, and I want to talk about the hospital issue, because that's what everybody seems to be discussing right now. Only a few days ago, we had the Western corporate press kicking into overdrive with reports of hospital bombings and dead civilians, war crimes. All of it, of course, predictably blamed on Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government. So according to Western governments and the media mouthpieces that they have, Assad's forces have targeted civilian hospitals in order to, well, we don't really know why Assad's forces would logically target civilian hospitals, but this is what the Western press, the media, the human rights NGOs are all trying to claim, right? They're trying to hammer these unsubstantiated claims, this misinformation at the top of their lungs into the general public's psyche and awareness, right? That the SAA is dropping bombs on civilian medical facilities. That's the gist of their reports. So let's look at this. Let's look at the first hospital that we're hearing about, the Al-Quds Hospital. The bombing that is being attributed to the Syrian military is the destruction of the Al-Quds Hospital. That's an alleged Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, which is located in Aleppo. And that's MSF, by the way, is also Doctors Without Borders, and we've discussed them on this show many times. Now, it's important to note that the alleged hospital that was bombed, that was allegedly bombed, was not a Doctors Without Borders facility. It was one that was supported by Doctors Without Borders, by MSF. And this might seem like a small technicality, but it's actually an important difference, since Doctors Without Borders is well known to be anything but an impartial observer of the Syrian crisis. Remember, the Western media often describes this organization as independent, but nothing could be further from the truth. To begin with, Doctors Without Borders is fully funded by the very same corporate financier interests behind Wall Street and London's collective foreign policy. That's including regime change in Syria and regime change in Iran. Doctors Without Borders, their own annual report, the 2010 report, you can look it up, it's online. It has financial donors that include Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, Google, Microsoft, Bloomberg, Bain Capital, myriad of other corporate financier interests as well. Doctors Without Borders has bankers on its board of advisors, including Elizabeth Bichelle Robinson of Goldman Sachs. If we're talking about their independence, their aid claims and so forth, their medical facilities are set up almost exclusively, and I would almost say exclusively, in terrorist-held regions of Syria, especially along the northern border with Turkey. In an interview with NPR, we had the Doctors Without Borders representative Stephen Cornish really revealing the nature of his organization's involvement in the Syrian conflict. And he explains that the aid is being sent to regions outside of the Syrian government's control, and that his organization is setting up facilities in those areas. This is what he says. Over the past month, we've had a surgery that was open inside a cave. We've had another that was open in a chicken farm Good job. And a third one in a house. And these structures, we tried to outfit them as best we can, enough to modern technology and with full medical teams. The originally were dealing with combatant injuries and people who were civilians who were directly affected by the conflict. So in other words, the Wall Street funded organization is providing support for militants armed and funded by the West and the regional allies of the West, most of whom are revealed to be foreign fighters affiliated with or directly belonging to Al-Qaeda and its de facto political wing, the Muslim Brotherhood. This so-called international aid organization is just another cog in the covert military machine being turned against Syria, and it serves the role as a medical battalion in that proxy war. So again, that NPR interview with Cornish, he admits the fact that the organization that has largely provided medical aid to the death squads, not just as a matter of unbiased, Hippocratic oath-based treatment, but what appears to be a rebel-based program. Again, he says, quote, they originally were dealing mainly with combatant injuries. Okay, so even assuming that the civilians that Cornish mentions are truly civilians, Cornish's team has been focused largely on combatant injuries, and he says that. And that's an interesting focus, concerning that the teams are mainly located within terrorist-controlled territory. So Cornish removes all doubt about whether or not the death squads are receiving priority care as the interview continued. Let me read the interview. So it is very difficult for civilians to find care. And one of the difficulties also is that a number of smaller surgeries that have been set up are either overwhelmed with combatants or primarily taking care of combatants. And what we would certainly urge is that all surgeries and all health posts also are accommodating the civilian population. And he's asked by the interviewer, you mean, in other words, that the fighters are getting priority for medical care and the civilians are suffering for that? And the Cornish responds, unfortunately, that is sometimes the reality on the ground. Some of the surgeries we visited, you could tell that because not only there were no civilians on the wards, but there were also no beds or toilet facilities for women. So it's kind of a dead giveaway. Okay, end quote. That should speak for itself, but let's return to the question of the Al-Quds Hospital. We have to note that the facility that has been reported to be nothing more than a field hospital for terrorists trapped in Aleppo in the past. The bombing of this hospital allegedly killed over 50 death squad fighters, at least according to reports by Ziad Fadel of Syrian Perspective. After all, the hospital was being run in the death squad terrorist-held area of Sukhari, right? So basically what I'm trying to get at here is Fadel is reporting that Al-Quds did exist as a hospital, but it existed as a field hospital for terrorists in terrorist-held areas, in the terrorist-held area of Sukhari. Now, some researchers are disputing whether or not the hospital was ever actually bombed. We have the Syrian and Russian governments denying bombing the hospital to begin with. The Russians actually suggested that the anti-ISIS coalition, meaning the NATO powers, were operating fighter jets in the area around the time of the bombing, which is implying that the bombing may have been conducted by the American forces. The U.S. denies that claim, obviously. Now, in addition to the question of whether or not the bombed hospital was a civilian operation or a combatant operation, there's even the question as to whether or not the field hospital that was bombed was actually Al-Quds. And strangely enough, there's a question about whether or not Al-Quds ever actually existed. So, for instance, we have Dr. Nabil Antaki. That's a doctor based in western Aleppo who called into question the existence of Al-Quds. All right, after viewing the Channel 4 video showing the hospital moments before the attack, he says, quote, this hospital, Al-Quds, did not exist before the war started. It must have been installed in a building after the war began. I don't know anyone in the east of Aleppo who could confirm this hospital is Al-Quds. Okay? So, did it exist? Did it not exist? Did it get bombed? Did it not get bombed? We don't fully know in that instance. If it did exist, then there's evidence that if it did exist, that it was a field hospital for terrorists. So this is not what's being presented in the mainstream media, of course. Now, there's another hospital, Al-Dabit. right? Let's look at this. If the pinnacle of war crimes and brutality is the bombing of a hospital, the United States is being forced to eat its own words now, because only after a few days of propagandizing the Western public with reports of the Syrian army bombing this Al-Quds hospital, the West's own terrorist pits began openly firing missiles at another hospital in Aleppo. Obviously, the United States made no mention of its own bombing, the U.S. bombing of a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan earlier this year. That was not mentioned, but they went crazy on the Al-Quds. So the U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, Horseface Kerry, is forced to condemn the rocket attacks now aimed at the Syrian hospital by the Western-backed terrorists, albeit in a manner which would not directly attribute the blame to the terrorists. On May 3rd, we have the Sana news agency reporting, terrorists fired 65 rocket shells on the neighborhoods of Al-Nil Street, Al-Siryan, Al-Khalidiya, Al-Mokambo, Al-Sabil, and the surroundings of Al-Harman Mosque, leaving 11 civilians killed and 37 injured. A source at Aleppo Health Directorate said that most of the wounded civilians are children and women, and their injuries are severe, as the number of the killed civilians might increase. Okay, we had Eva Bartlett, a fine journalist who covers the Syrian crisis. She has a great article, Hospitals Bombed, Aleppo Burning Under Moderate Terrorist Bombs. She points out that the Sana's correspondent in Aleppo reported that 3 women were killed, 17 other women and children were wounded. Extensive material damage was caused by the terrorist organization's attack with a rocket shell on Al-Dabit in Al-Mufahaza neighborhood. Right? She also points out the districts. There were other districts that were attacked. We have Jamiat al-Zahra, Al-Amariya, Al-Ramusa, Al-Musharaka, Al-Mufaza, Al-Mariaden, Al-Siriyan, Al-Sabel, and Al-Jamilia. Right, so these were the bombed neighborhoods and districts in Aleppo by the terrorists. Right, and we have an update coming from the Sana News Agency Facebook page, which had a number of photos of the bombed Al-Dabit hospital. All right, so we have photographic evidence, and the number of dead had risen to 14, and of course it rose even further, I think up to 28, and might even be upwards of that. We have Rupley TV raw footage showing the impacts of the bombings and uncensored some of the victims. So we have video footage as well. So we have a tale of 2 hospitals, right? At least from the point of view of the West and the Anglo-Americans. In the Western media, one hospital bombing, if it ever actually took place, if the hospital ever actually existed, that equals a war crime, and that warrants the condemnation of the world. While the other hospital bombing, of which we know happened, and which we know who the perpetrators were, and we know that the victims were civilians, that only warrants forced, hesitant, and tepid complaint. And even the painful admission that the bombing of civilians and civilian hospitals is wrong was barely uttered out of Horseface Kerry's mouth before it was accompanied by the requisite condemnation of the Syrian government and the truly elected president, Bashar al-Assad. So the recent bombing of Al-Dabit is nothing new in Syria. Western-backed terrorists have been launching assaults on hospitals since the beginning of the crisis. Professor Tim Anderson, who also is a fine journalist and researcher, points out that over the past 5 years, the Al-Qaeda groups have attacked 2/3 of all Syria's hospitals and clinics. 2/3, plus pharmaceutical factories, many of which were in Aleppo. The most recent one is Al-Dabit, right? We also had Al-Razi General Hospital hit by Nusra Coalition just a few days prior to this. We had the bombing of Al-Watani Hospital in Qusair, bombed by the Farouk FSA. We had Al-Nusra and the FSA suicide bombing at Al-Kindi Hospital in Aleppo. We had Al-Qaeda groups bombing Ibn Rushd Hospital in Aleppo on April 26th. Right? We had Al-Razi General Hospital. It was hit a few days ago, as I just mentioned. So, instead of reporting on these documented instances of terrorists who are filming themselves attacking Syrian hospitals, the corporate media and the propagandizing human rights groups are filling front pages and TV screens with screaming accusations of the Syrian army and Russia having bombed a so-called MSF hospital in Aleppo. So obviously the Western indignation over the alleged bombing of the Al-Quds alleged non-hospital was never anything more than propaganda, which was aimed at drumming up support for greater U.S. military involvement in Syria and the increased attempt at destroying the secular Syrian government. At best, the information repeated to the Western audiences was misconstrued, and at worst, it was entirely made up. Now, I would like to draw your attention to another video, because we've only got about 9 minutes here. I did an article recently, which I have to say I believe may be the best article I've ever written. It's up on BrandonTurbeville.com, activistpost.com. It's entitled, America's Legacy Will Be Its Downfall. Empire Always Comes Home. And I start the article off with a quote by Alan Watt of CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com, and he says, "Remember, it's supposed to come right back here because that which the U.S. has created, and maybe perhaps even the very reason for that America was set up to do, is almost accomplished. Once it's accomplished, they'll be doing the same thing back home. You'll submerge into the world system you helped create." And I think he's exactly right. Now, in that article, I have a video of the bombing of Aleppo by the terrorists that John Kerry does not want to address, right? And this is footage that will never be shown on Western media. If it is shown on Western media, it will be blamed on Assad, and it will be to drum up support for a war. But this is there's graphic images, and it's at the bottom of the article. But I highly encourage you to watch this. Right? You really need to watch this video if you want to get an idea for what's happening there. So we have Western media outlets in the U.S. State Department that are trying to gin up public sentiment surrounding these bombings, alleged bombings of alleged hospitals that may or may not have even existed. And even if they did, were just field hospitals for terrorists. The Syrian people themselves are suffering under unimaginable conditions. And these victims, the real ones, are completely ignored by the same outlets that cry and pine and whine over the deaths of jihadists and rapists and torturers and murderers. Surrounding it's constant propaganda, and it's a dehumanizing method of reporting so-called news in the West. The humanity and the wishes of the Syrian people are completely lost. Right? In the video that I mentioned in the article, it's posted by the ANA News Agency, you're able to see footage of Aleppo where the Western-backed terrorists are lobbing missiles and bombing against civilian targets. And that's, like as I said, that's film that's never going to be played on Western televisions because they're gonna do so under the guise of protecting a violence-ridden and violence-obsessed public from the graphic images, and which always disgusts me. You will never hear me warn you when I post something that, to beware. There's graphic images. If you live in the United States, you can see graphic images. You're an adult, right? You can deal with graphic images. This whole culture is obsessed with violence. So don't tell me that I should be responsible for warning you that something may have a trigger warning or something because of violence. This is America, right? This is what we do. So the Western media, of course, is going to play this because they don't want to have the graphic images of the results of American intellectual laziness and lack of moral conviction. That's really the biggest reason they don't put it on TV. And of course, graphic images aren't a problem for Americans when it's movie time, of course, but when violent images come home to roost, real ones, then we have to have trigger warnings and we have to have censorship. So that's unless we need to, the government needs to stir up public support for a foreign war. That's if it's dire enough to warrant its presentation, then they will do it. But scenes from Aleppo are only going to be shown when media outlets are able to twist the footage into a report on the crimes of Assad instead of the natural progression of acts of destabilization set into motion by the United States and its coalition, and so forth. Right? All this stuff that's happening in Syria, every bit of it, is the fault of the United States, Britain, France, the GCC, Israel, and the NATO powers. All of it. It's their fault. Now, in this video that you really must go see, you can see footage that depicts a way of life that only 5 years ago, contrary to Western brainwashing, was unimaginable to any sane person, and it would have been unimaginable to any Syrian. The first scene is shortly after a terrorist bombing in West Aleppo, where you can see a young man speaking to his mother and telling her, "I'll call you back later. Another bomb has fallen. I'll call you back." And you can hear the women and children screaming. You can see the silence of the dead, the sirens trying to respond to the fires, carry away the injured. You can hear the men shouting. Some of them are angry, some of them are overtaken with grief, and some of them are just trying to rescue people who have been buried under the rubble or injured. We can see a woman shouting at a Syrian soldier. She's not angry. She's shouting in despair. She's begging the Syrian soldier to save her and her people from the Western-backed terrorists, from the democracy that America claims that it's trying to impose on her. She's calling on the Syrian people, the Syrian military, to save her. There, you could see another woman shouting similar sentiment. Right? We see a man screaming. He says that the U.S. is sending rockets to kill the Syrian people. We don't want this. We want military aid for the Syrian army. These are our sons. These are the people who are defending us. You won't see that on the Western media. And as the way they are presented in the U.S. media, the Syrian people, like just about every other person across the world, are presented in a way that they're dehumanized. In American media, Syrians are not human. They're just numbers. 100 died today, 86 died the day before, and they're just numbers on a chart. To American audiences, Syrians are not mothers or sons. They're not fathers or little children or grandparents. They're just blips on a screen. They're data in a spreadsheet. And this is how they're presented to an increasingly hard-hearted American public. This is a nation that's becoming more and more desensitized to death and destruction and degradation here, not just all across the rest of the world, but even here. And each one of the numbers that Americans go about their day not being aware of had a mother and a father. They had children, some of them. Some of them had girlfriends. Some of them had husbands. Some of them had careers, pets. They had hopes for the future. They had plans. Each one of them had a history and a life story. And for these people, all of that's gone. And it's not coming back. And its absence has left a massive hole in the life of someone else. Just because you didn't know them doesn't mean that that's not the case. So in this 3 minutes of footage, the news agency sums up in minutes what's going to be the legacy of the United States. Even if the government in Syria is successful in returning the country to some sense of normalcy, we have a gaping hole in the collective consciousness of the people there. And it's going to remain because there will be the silence of hundreds of thousands of people who would have been part of the cities and the towns and the family dinners and the coffee shops and the bars if the United States had never put the country in its sights. In Libya, America's legacy is thousands dead and a civilized country that was returned to barbarism and violence. In Iraq, unbelievable destruction and death is continuing, while years of use of depleted uranium are going to leave a lasting reminder of America as generations are born disfigured and deformed and drastically ill. Decades on, Vietnam has the scars of America. All across the world, the United States has left a trail of destruction and death on a massive scale. Only within its own borders does anybody think that the United States represents freedom and democracy. And just to add icing on the cake, the tragedy here also, another tragedy, is that this nation, which could have been the greatest force for good in the world, is now one of the greatest forces for evil the world has ever known. The American people themselves are suffering daily under this same empire, this same control system. But they need to understand that their own apathy is the silent acquiescence to the destruction abroad and the inevitable destruction that's coming back home. So what we have set loose on foreign people overseas cannot help but one day come home. Today, it's the Syrians who are burying their friends and their children. But the meat grinder of the empire always comes back home and turns on its own citizens what it turned on foreign peoples in foreign lands at one time. If Americans can't speak out against the destruction of Syria because of their own moral compass and their own humanity, they'd better do so out of a sense of self-preservation, and they'd better do so now. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
You're listening to UCY.tv. Why don't